Hey everyone, this is Terrible Dactyl. Well, not this. This is actually not too terrible. Welcome to Jurassic Plastic. I thought I would introduce myself by showing you my very first museum quality dinosaur toy. Although, technically this is not a dinosaur. This is a pterosaur. This is the 1988 Carnegie Collection Pteranodon by Safari Ltd. But until the beginning of the 1990s, dinosaur toys were really just toys to me. They were action figures at best and cheap plastic garbage at worst, like the little bag of knockoff Marx figures that I got from the Museum of Natural History in 1987 that included little Dungeons and Dragons monsters in with the various dinosaurs and dimetrodons and things like that. Now, around 1991, my dad took me to a tiny little hobby shop. We were looking for a model train set. And this guy had set up basically in his garage, his own hobby store, packed full of train sets and scale model things, and nestled in one of the corners was a little display. Not the big Carnegie Mountain display that we've all seen before, but just a little stand with guys like this. The Carnegie Collection, the first few models. These, to me, looked more like miniature replicas or sculptures that you would see in a museum rather than toys. My brain registered them differently thanks to the detailed sculpting, the feel of the material, the heft. Well, not this one, but especially in the big Brachiosaurus, no hollow plastic here. The glossiness of these, the very layered paint applications, and I was hooked. This Pteranodon right here was the cheapest one they had. So I was able to convince my dad to get it for me. I think this was $2 or $3 back at the time. This is not the most scientifically accurate model anymore, but it's really still a beautiful model. So let's get into some of the details. The scale of this model is exactly 1:40 going by the 16 centimeter wing length. Now, the largest Pteranodon skull that we have is almost 2 meters long. Smaller ones are much more common, though. If you scale this by the skull could actually be a little bit bigger, I guess translating into an overall even larger animal. But overall, this would fit in well with any 140 display. And you can see it here compared to the older Invicta version, which has about the same wingspan. If you actually compare the wings and take into account the fact that the Safari one has the wings a little bit scrunched together, the Invicta one's a little bit more stretched out. The wingspan is about the same on these, although you can see that the Invicta skull or head is actually a little bit smaller, and this one is advertised at 145 scale. So right away you can see that the proportions of this Pteranodon are a little bit off. It could definitely do with longer wings, and Pteranodon is well known as basically a Cretaceous seabird or albatross-like animal that was going to have very, very long, skinny wings, probably that would look longer than this if you really stretch them out. This is a very rubbery, flexible material. If you actually look at a couple of the paint rubs that I have on mine, obviously my very old sample, if you can see that on here, it's made of a sort of beige or whitish rubber, and that kind of flexible material really stuck with this model throughout its life. This model continued to be used by Safari for the Carnegie Collection in various different forms right up until its cancellation in 2015. And unlike a lot of the Carnegie Collection models, which started out with very flexible rubbery plastic, well, this one, they really had no choice but to stick with that rubber because of just how thin it is. The pose here is a little bit awkward, especially for play. It's not quite walking. Even back in the 1980s, I think they understood that pterosaurs would have walked with their feet at least a little bit more underneath their bodies. And it's not quite flying either. As I showed you before, the wings are retracted. It's just kind of got its head pulled back into a loud squawk, although it's posable enough that you can kind of get some give here to move it around if you really wanted to play with it. I think it's really intended to be like one of those old 19th century paintings of pterosaurs kind of clinging to the sides of cliff faces or perched up on rocks. Other than the wing length, the proportions are generally accurate on this model. You can see it's got very short legs, which is characteristic of Pteranodon, and a relatively short neck. Some nice wrinkling detail on the bottom of the neck here. You can see where its sort of throat pouch might be contracted, pelican-like throat pouch there. Based on a modern understanding of Pteranodon, we know that the beak should probably be quite a lot longer, and especially the lower jaw here should be a lot deeper. These things really had long, sword-like bills. This one is typical of maybe a smaller female Pteranodon rather than a male, which are the ones that have the long pointed crest in the back. The females just had a little stubby crest here. The fingers are a little bit too big. Obviously that's forgivable by the small scale. The pteroid bone, which would normally be a small bone that projects inwards from the wrist to support the patagium here at the front of the wing, is really absent. And if you look carefully, you can see that this patagium is a little small. You probably could have gotten away with sculpting the elbow at a steeper angle here to give it more of a patagium and bring those arms back a little bit for a good flight posture. Now, that pteroid bone would not necessarily have been visible in life. We know based on modern research that pterosaurs had an extensive series of air sacs throughout the tissue in the wing that would have given this sort of a rounded profile in the front and probably obscured some of the details of the underlying anatomy here, like those pteroid bones and even the bones in the wing finger and the bones in the arm. Now obviously the wing finger you can kind of see sculpted here along the edge, and obviously the limb bones are visible. So with that amount of, dare I say it, shrink wrapping, the pteroid really should have been visible in this model, although I'm not sure how you would sculpt something that thin and delicate at this scale. The wings are also very leathery looking, very old school pterosaur wings, but they're beautifully sculpted. You can see all the little fine wrinkles and creases here in the wing. It really looks nice compared with this very layered, very subtle paint application where it goes from this darker beige to a lighter, almost white wing, and even across the whole body and the head. The only part where you've got really solid, glossy white paint here is on the underside of the throat, probably once again to sort of try and indicate that throat pouch that would have been present. But take a look at the detail on the face in this figure. It's got these awesome little creases and lines in the keratin of the beak. The sculpting around the eye is really nicely detailed. You go from these little ridges to the smooth crest, and if you look really closely at the body, it might be my imagination, but I think you can almost even make out some pycnofibers on here, which wouldn't necessarily be a first. I think Tycho would have had this model beat by a couple of years in their Dino Riders line, but especially if you look at the belly, you can see those little striations all along that could have been intended to represent furry pycnofibers. That might be being a little bit too generous, because you can see the same kind of striations here on the patagia between the legs, which is probably just skin texture that's been applied. Now, I don't want to praise the color scheme on this too much. We know that, like all of the stem avians, pterosaurs would have had very good color vision, and especially for a big male pteranodon with this big showy crest, it's a little unusual that it would be totally monochrome like this, just beige and cream and off-white and that little bit of orange on the inside of the mouth. The new Safari Pteranodon really improved on that with its bright orange tiger stripe crest. But you know, for its time, this is a really nice model. The later iterations of this model kind of did away with this beautifully layered beige to white color scheme. If you look at some of the newer ones from about the beginning of the 1990s onward, they were pretty much just flat brown, light brown, beige, and the paint applications were really simplified on these as the line went on. If you look at some of the more recent examples, instead of this little tiny black dot of an eye here, you've got this big round yellow splotch that makes it look like it's in a constant state of shock with its tiny black pupil in the middle of that massive yellow eye. This model was retooled at least a couple of times. The early 1990s samples, if you look at the stamp on the bottom of the wing here, they actually drop the words made in China and they drop the words Miami, Florida, and you can see where those were actually tooled out from the mold at that point. And the striations and some of the detailing and wrinkling on this model is much less evident in the more recent ones. They kind of got it a little bit more detailed for the 2007 re-release, where this is really more of a darker chocolate brown color. That one seems to be pretty uncommon. I haven't seen too many of those floating around, only one or two pictures online, which I'll post in the links. But overall, you know, for a little $2 or $3 figure at the time I bought it, this is a really nice model. You can see, compared to the kinds of dinosaur toys that would have been available at this time, why the Carnegie Collection immediately became so popular. Now, I know that the Invicta British Museum collection was also very popular back in the 1980s, but despite how nice those sculpts are, you can't really beat the paint applications, the glossy look. I mean, this really looks more like a model than a toy. So obviously, I only convinced my dad to spend $2 or $3 on this thing, but before too long, I was hooked, and I had the whole collection. I had the massive Brachiosaurus, I had the Diplodocus, and I still have most of them today, which will be most of the features that I'm going to be reviewing and talking about here on Jurassic Plastic. We're going to be talking about comparison between the different models. We're going to be looking at how these different Carnegie models evolved through time, the different toolings, the different molds, the different paint applications that were used in some cases, and we'll also be looking at some of the more modern dinosaur models, especially the ones that Safari Ltd is still producing today. So I hope you will stay tuned and join me again for our next episode of Jurassic Plastic. Thanks, guys.